It's the first time in 24 years that the Russian president has gone to North Korea and the round explodes in the gun barrel itself, wipes out the crew that are operating it as well.
Labour is dealing with the lingering remnants of Jeremy Corbyn. Good afternoon, Sean.
Good afternoon, Ben.
So we've tried to assess who's winning in the war between Russia and Ukraine. It's very hard. It seems to be up and down, depending on what the latest news is. And we've covered, and it's still a big issue, that Russia appears to be losing a lot of its modern tanks, and this is causing it to have to go back and retrieve tanks from the museum. One particular tank, the T-54, is being used. And I guess, if it moves like a tank, shoots like a tank, it is a tank. But it doesn't quite match up to the modern weaponry we've got. So I think it'd be really good to find out just what this device is and where its weaknesses are and how Russia's desperately trying to overcome those.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, as you said, right up front, we're not there counting the tanks and there's a propaganda war going on. We accept all that. But there's a lot of military analysts trying to do their best, try and work out exactly what the price of this war is. And over 3,000 tanks have now been lost by Russia. Now, some of the analysts turn around and say, well, they've got over 13,000 tanks in storage, so why does it matter? Well, they've lost the modern battle tanks, and as you say, they have historically kept lots of these World War II vintages. Now, the T-54 and the T-62, the numbers refer to largely the years in which they entered service. So 1954, 1962. Now, as you say, these tanks, they can fire around. They're bulletproof. They provide some protection for the crew inside, and they're largely impervious to artillery shells. So does it really matter?
Well, 54, I was born before 54, so they're not that old. They're still in service, like me.
Yeah, I think in military parlance that would appear ancient. I clearly beg to differ with you, but yes, I mean, if you imagine technology, how much it's moved along, and a good example of that is that when I was in the military, anti-tanks was one of the things that we tried to do. And at the time, it was cluster bombs, which are no longer used. But each of those units had 147 little bomblets. They were only about yay big, but they formed a plasma jet on impact that went cut through cast iron of a tank like a knife through butter and would cause carnage inside, cause the tank to brew up, as it were. And the trouble with the modern tanks have a really thick layer of armour, and they also have explosive reactive armour on the outside of them. So you'll sometimes see pictures of tanks with these boxes on the outside, covered in boxes. And the idea is that when something hits them, they explode outwards, pushing the impact and the plasma burst away from the tank. These old tanks, first of all, are very relatively thin-skinned. So any decent anti-tank weapon will carve through it. Anti-tank weapons are not that expensive. They're relatively plentiful. Ukrainians were always struggling a bit against the most modern battle tanks. They will not be struggling against the T-54s and T-62s. So these tanks can fire rounds. They can fire on the move, but they can't aim particularly well, whereas a modern battle tank will allow you to do that. But the big thing is Russia's paying a huge price on the battlefield because these tanks just don't pass muster on a modern battlefield. And just imagine what that must be like for the crews involved. Oh, we don't have any of the modern battle tanks. You need to jump into one of these World War II tanks.
Relics.
4 crews, cramped, and they're regularly cooking off on the battlefield, which is a horrible way for anybody to go. Just dreadful.
Well, if it's 3,000 tanks and there's 4 in each, I mean, roughly. I know you didn't mention that about the modern tanks. That's a lot of soldiers killed through one particular bit of the attack or defence machinery.
And for me, it's more that it's not just numbers here. With probably a week's worth of training, I could get you to drive a tank around and potentially use it. But in terms of tactically knowing how to operate in a formation of tanks, how to provide cover for each other, who's looking at what quadrant, who's taking what target, that operational effectiveness comes with experience. And the danger is, once you start losing a lot of crews, you lose that experience. And all you're effectively doing is putting newly qualified drivers into a tank. Yes, they can go forward, backwards and drive around the battlefield. But in terms of being tactically aware, using these tanks as they were designed to be used, that's almost certainly not happening on the Russian. And it probably explains why they're losing so many. But for me, it's not just about the numbers. It's just indicative. Russia is on the front foot on the battlefields at the moment. And the danger is we see President Putin walking around looking smug and telling, yes, I'll end the war if Ukraine just steps away from the occupied territories. This is a clear indication. There's evidence of these tanks being pushed in large quantities. I think we've got some video footage of some of them moving out from Russia, from the storage areas. That is not an effective way to fight a war. And it's very profligate with your soldiers, the crew inside them.
I heard a story the other day, which sounds plausible. Do you remember we had Air Marshal Greg Bagwell on a few weeks ago, and he was
very good.
He was very good, wasn't he? And we talked about the drone, the grenade carrying drone. It's been an expensive way to carry a grenade, but actually quite useful. I heard that what the very, very cheap drones, I mean, I'm talking about $1,000 as opposed to 50,000, were getting very good at was literally carrying a grenade and getting above a tank and dropping it through, what's it called, the porthole or something? Drop it through the hatch. Dropping it through the hatch and then exploding. That's the end of the tank.
Yeah.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, it might not be the end of the tank, but it's certainly the end of the crew. And as soon as you lost the crew, you're back into the how do you train new sets, which is why they've got these little tents being set up over the top of them, and there's pictures of some of them on fire or whatever. Now, there's always innovation on the battlefield. I get all that, but it is not a good sign when a 21st century world superpower is fielding World War II tanks to make up the numbers.
Yeah. So we've got Ukraine, actually behind Ukraine, NATO in the West, an institution of equal-minded countries. You've got Russia on its own, Putin potentially feeling isolated and looking for friends, and he's making friends with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Dangerous bedfellow maybe, but nonetheless he's doing it, and there's lots of reasons from his point of view why that would be productive for his current position in the war, and part of that is the weapons exchange or purchase that comes from it. And he appears to have breached his own agreements by doing so, hasn't he, Sean?
He has, yeah. President Putin's on a middle of a 2-day visit as we're filming this to North Korea. The last time it's a state visit, they've had pictures of him up. They've rolled out the red carpet. It's a massive visit for North Korea, but it's the first time in 24 years that the Russian president has gone to North Korea. And the question is, why now? And as you say, Russia sort of expected this war in Ukraine to be 3 to 10 days and it will be over. We're now into well over 840 days into this war, and the vast quantities of ammunition that are being consumed, even though Russia has spun up its defence industrial base to 3 times the size it was at the start of the war, it still can't keep pace with the rates at which the ammunition, for example, is being used. So North Korea has agreed to provide a load of ammunition. Reports suggest about 4 million rounds have been provided so far. And just to put that into context, the EU, a collection of very wealthy countries, not North Korea, pledged earlier on this year to provide 1 million rounds by the end of the year, and they're not on track to do that yet. And yet here we've got North Korea piling that in. Now, what I find most fascinating about this is that you talk about dancing with the devil. There's a Russia is part of the United Nations. There was a United Nations Security Council resolution. It's got the number 1874, which specifically bans North Korea from exporting weapons. So Russia, who signed up to that, they agreed to it, have now basically completely ignored that, and they're busy buying huge quantities of weapons from North Korea. Both North Korea and Russia deny it, but there's increasing evidence that this is actually going on, and also buying weapons from Iran. And I think it's a really interesting take on bedfellows, you called it. Where does this go? Where does this axis of evil culminate? Is Russia trying to generate an alternative, an alter ego to NATO?
Yeah, definitely.
And it feels that way.
It does a bit, yeah. And the currency, was it dollars or?
Well, I say at the moment, I think what's actually happening, it's more about Kim Jong-un needs hard currency, but he also needs food. He also needs help with his weapons program. He also needs help with missile technology. And what looks very likely is that most of the West won't do business with North Korea, and it struggles to get hold of any of the component parts. What it'll get through Russia is massive support to help it on its way. And I think that is, the North Korean regime has tried very hard. It basically starves its people in order to keep progressing its weapons programs. And that seems to be the area that Putin is happy to help with.
Yeah, I got a question about quality, but before we get into that, just a small thought. At the same time this is happening, and you said it's an alternative to NATO, which actually is completely understandable. We've already got the BRICS alliance across the world: Brazil, Russia, India, China, now South Africa, and actually a list of, 15 or 20 other nations wanting to join this. From a military point of view, that could be substantial. From a currency point of view, there's a lot of talk around the network saying if you can find an alternative currency alliance to the dollar, then you damage dollar. Everything seems, the big stuff in the world oil exchange is priced in dollars. So there's another game going on here potentially as well.
No, and there's several things that are linked to it. I mean, BRICS is interesting because it's where the line between economics and military transgress. I mean, it's quite interesting that China and Russia are not natural bedfellows. No. It's pretty clear that China wants to do trade with the rest of the world. But it doesn't necessarily subscribe to the sort of Western order of democracy or the model that the West subscribes, and that's fine. At the moment, there's sort of China doesn't want to jump into bed with Russia, but is providing tacit support. And I think if they were to have Spectre, if they were to create an alternative to NATO and call it something sexy like Spectre, I'm not sure China would actually want to be part of it. It might suit Iran, it might suit Russia, it might suit North Korea. Not entirely sure it would suit India, South Africa and the like.
Yeah.
But I do think the world order, dominated, as you say, by the common currency of the dollar, I do think some of that is going to be shaken over the coming years. Yeah.
Yes. Interesting. So, I don't know, but stuff that comes from America or UK will go through intense quality processes that have been developed over decades, so that when something arrives on the battlefield, it works. And a shell only needs to be a little bit wrong, twisted, or a millimetre, and you've got, some disaster. So is that an issue that people are worried about, or do we have evidence of problems?
Well, yeah, so one of the things that I ferreted into a little bit was North Korea is not famous for its quality control. It creates large quantity, but not necessarily quality. And there are increasing reports from the battlefield at the moment, not only of these rounds failing to detonate, the artillery rounds failing to detonate when they hit the ground. There's no great shakes about that. But the one thing that does matter is the tolerances in a barrel are very tight, and the amount of explosive, how quickly it goes off, etc., all matters. If that goes wrong and the round explodes in the gun barrel itself, and there's increasing reports of this happening, and I'm sure it's not coincidence that it's married up to these North Korean artillery shells. Not only does it completely destroy the piece of artillery, but more importantly, it wipes out the crew that are operating it as well. And I think that's something that they're seeing an increasing amount of this. And you and I, if I was operating that and I knew that there were some North Korean artillery rounds, potentially a long bit of string, go a long way back before you fire this thing off.
Yeah.
And I do think it's back to this morale. It's back to people need to have faith and trust in the equipment they're using. And as soon as things like this happen and you erode that trust, then I think that's a really difficult time. And it's just another example. If you look at face value, Russia's on the front foot, but actually it's being forced to go out to the international community, to North Korea, to bring in available, cheap ammunition, and there is a price to pay for that. And tragically, some of the Russian soldiers are paying that price.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk, understandably, that when Russia attacked Ukraine, the availability of Russian natural resources, oil and gas, diminished, and that was seen to be an issue for Russia in terms of its exports, and indeed the West, for two reasons. One, it didn't want to buy fossil fuels, and secondly, the supplies were cut off. That's put a huge amount of strain on the EU. Germany in particular suffered a lot from that. If you actually delve in and look at the numbers, you find that the imports from Russia to India of, I think, oil prior to the invasion of Ukraine were well below 10%, 3 or 4% or something. If you look at the exports now, it's like 30, 40%. So actually, Russia's not lost much. It's found other partners, going back to the conversation we had a second ago. The other fantastic thing is that what India then does with that, it adds some refining processes. And guess who they sell it to? They sell it to the West. So the West is still buying Russian oil, which is not green. And secondly, it's not playing into let's deplete the economy of Russia.
I've read a few interesting articles about this that talked about, largely as a result, because Zelensky's been using his drones to target Russian oil supply.
Yeah.
And as we film at the moment, there's huge flames blazing away at one of the refineries at Azov, apparently. Now, reports suggest that America had pulled Zelensky aside and said, look, will you stop doing this? Because if you reduce supply, demand stays the same, therefore prices go up, and that's not welcome. And Zelensky's gone, hang on a minute, this is how he's funding the war. So surely you've got to do something about it. I think what's fascinating is that day one of the war, lots of sanctions, we're not going to buy Russian oil. The harsh reality is that, let's supposing the world consumption was 100 barrels of oil a year and 100 litres of gas a year. That's what we need. We may not buy it from Russia, but we'll buy it from somebody else. But the total available supply will still be 100. It's just where you buy it from may shift around. What has happened is that the price that Russia gets for its oil has been reduced as a result, because countries like China that buy a lot of it have gone to Russia. Okay, so
fair enough,
you can't sell this easily on the global stage. I'll buy it, but I expect a significant discount. So, but whether that's had a material effect on Russia, who knows? But supply and demand, you can't change that. There's the same amount of oil and gas being used in this world, and the same people are supplying it. It's just a question of how it finds its way.
Finds its way.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, one of the biggest bits of news really at the moment in the conflict between Israel and Gaza is the ceasefire proposal that I think pretty much everybody had agreed to. We covered it last week. It was a sign of hope. Appears to have been rolling around for a few weeks now. There's been a bit of a blockage, I think, from Hamas' point of view. What's your take on where we got to?
Yeah, it was. I must admit, I'm still a bit sceptical because if we recall that President Biden had put a proposal on the table, he'd run it through UN Security Council, they had approved it, and America hadn't vetoed it, which meant that Israel was now tied to it. So if Hamas had agreed to it, it would have been imposed. And that put Prime Minister Netanyahu in a really difficult position. One of his war cabinet resigned. He's now dissolved the war cabinet as a result. And he's tap dancing his way, trying to stay in power at the moment, whilst also trying to continue with the Hamas operation in Rafah. So he's trying to wipe out the last bit of Hamas, even though the international community has said, stop. There's a rising tide of concern about the humanitarian aid because some of the crossings aid crossings have been closed. The US had built that pontoon. That got wrecked a second time, and that's a way being repaired. So the humanitarian situation has been sort of spiraling a little bit out of control. I think one of the reasons that, but you'd probably be a better place to say, but it felt like the Palestinian question hadn't been answered. But didn't Anthony Blinken have a few words to say about it this week as well?
Yeah, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, stood up and gave an update. I look at these things, I listen. I need to hear it from 4 other sources before I sort of not just believe it, but understand the richness, because the politics of this are just absolutely furious. But basically said the peace proposal, the ceasefire proposal, had been agreed pretty much everywhere. We were waiting for Hamas. They took a couple of weeks to come back. the proposal that was on the table was pretty much exactly the same as the one that Hamas had agreed to back in May the 6th, whatever the date was. They came back with several objections, which for the time being has sort of killed it. And a couple of them looks like it's going to be quite difficult to overcome and sort of pass initiative in a way back to Israel, because, you know, on the face of it, it looked like they were either going to agree or, as you said, actually had no choice but to agree. So it looks like the thing has stalled a bit.
Yeah, and again, until they actually solve the actual underlying question, which, you know, Hamas has said, if you solve the Palestinian question, we'll put our arms down tomorrow. Whether you believe them or not is another matter. But that's what's been going on. The other bit of me that's always a bit suspicious here is Netanyahu clearly is doing a difficult job, but also clinging to power a bit at the moment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that over the last couple of weeks, particularly the last few days, we've seen a massive increase in Hezbollah attacks in the north of Israel. Part of that is that Hezbollah have always said we stand in support of Hamas, and if Hamas are encountering difficulties on the battlefield in Rafah, then launching more attacks is another way of diverting Israel. But if you look at it from Israel's perspective, they might want to deal with the Hezbollah situation. It's been rumbling for several years, and the danger is they use this as a catalyst for dealing with that situation. It's a really febrile situation at the moment.
Yeah. And I think the other thing you said is it rather stupidly, you know, from a tactical point of view, if you're Iran and you are actually controlling proxy wars with the three H's, as we've said before, then this is quite a dangerous moment, because outwardly valid and humane reason why the Gaza conflict needs to be finished, that nobody can disagree with anywhere in the world. Hezbollah's situation is completely different. There isn't a Gaza in Lebanon. You know, there's just Hezbollah, terrorist organisation, you know, continual skirmishes over the last, 25, 30 years. And every now and again it blows up and lots of missiles are fired. What that would give the West, or that would give Israel and therefore the West the opportunity to say is, well, this war against Hamas is not about Gaza. This is about the land of Israel and this axis of evil that's trying to do it, which would completely shift the focus and actually give the West an opportunity to say, okay, we struggle schizophrenically with supporting the war against Gaza, but we definitely do not struggle with supporting the war against Hezbollah.
Yeah, and I think that it goes back into the history of Hezbollah, doesn't it? I think, but yeah, taking your point, I do think it's wrong to use frivolous words, but I never believe in coincidences, and it is interesting how has Israel precipitated the tension on the northern border. Part of the reason that Hezbollah say they're attacking is because they lost one of their senior commanders recently, so they've upped the ante. But actually, is all part of this. You know, Israel, Netanyahu, they've been around some years now. They're canny. And if they can distract attention from the ongoing operation in Rafah, and as you say, make this more about the survival of the Israeli state rather than wiping out Hamas, is that just an effort to change the news agenda?
Well, it seems to me every war has got politics in it, whether we like it or not. In the last big skirmish with Hezbollah, which I think is called the last Lebanon War, between Hezbollah and Israel, something like 4,000 missiles were fired in a month. That's a pretty big distraction coming from the other side. So I think it's who might win the politics here might be the issue.
Well, yeah, I try and start with these things about the military side. So Hezbollah, various reports, 20,000, 100,000 troops, depending on who you believe. They've got some tanks, they've got small arms, a bit of artillery, rockets, but they're not a modern military capability, not like Israel. Israel can draw on over 1/3 people, and it's got a 21st century military. So the war you refer to, even though there are a lot of independent analysts that say that it was a draw, all that Hezbollah won, what they mean is Hezbollah survived. They weren't able to beat Israel, but Lebanon paid a huge price for that war. And if you look where we are today, Hezbollah has shifted from being purely a militant organization to having a foothold in the politics
definitely,
in Lebanon.
Yeah.
I think they only hold about 13 seats of the 100-odd seats that are there. But the population seems increasingly unhappy with Hezbollah because the quality of living has been going down in Lebanon. The last thing anybody in Lebanon wants to see is another war, because they know that a lot of Lebanon will be leveled if that's the case. So Hezbollah has sort of been described as a state within a state, funded by Iran, equipped by Iran, trained by Iran, provoking on an agenda that's linked to Iran, but from Lebanon soil. That is a very difficult mix, and I'd be fascinated to see Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of the Hezbollah. I think it'll be walking an interesting tightrope here. I'm not entirely sure he'll want a war with Israel, because the danger is that's the straw on the camel's back that breaks the back of Hezbollah being welcomed in Lebanon. And at the moment, they use Lebanon as a sort of an outpost from which they exert influence. I'm being benevolent around the world.
Sure, it'd be really difficult for this afternoon's show, based in England, not to talk about the UK election. That would be remiss. It's been tough in the past to make defence a sort of top issue in terms of voting intentions. That may have changed. I think you've got some opinions on that. From Labour is odds on to win at the moment. Labour is dealing with the lingering remnants of Jeremy Corbyn, CND, etc. Therefore, UK's confidence that Labour would be a good national defence, institution, and that may have changed. We're right in the intense final throes of the election. How is that looking at the moment?
Yeah, it's fascinating. As you say, we're trying to keep out of the politics of this, don't we? But inevitably, I still struggle. We're war brewing in Central Europe, actually raging in Central Europe, Eastern Europe. The worry is that actually are any of our military issues being taken to the voters, because it's consistently a low priority. It's being throwaway lines at the moment. We saw Nigel Farage the other day say, I'd increase the army size to 100,000. You go, right, given that there's most of the policies so far have been gone through and they've been costed and they don't stand close scrutiny at all, and you start to wonder what the agenda is behind certain individuals. But going back to the polls, back in 2020, it's only 4 years ago, one of these international polls that was looked at about who is most trusted to look after defence. And the national poll said Labour was only 11% of the population thought they could be trusted on defence, Conservatives 44%. And it goes to the point, I think, that Jeremy Corbyn want to get rid of the nuclear deterrent. Sir Keir Starmer worked underneath him, and everybody sort of went, oh, that was a soundbite you want to use today. Now, all of a sudden, Labour's put a different approach. We're much more committed. And interestingly now, Conservatives have dropped from 44% to 21%. In other words, how trusted you are to deal with defence. Labour at 22%. They're more trusted now on defence. And I find that fascinating, only because it's one thing what you say, it's quite another what you do. And the DNA of our leaders seems to me so important. And that's why it goes all the way full circle to President Biden, who, whatever one may think, in an election year, they're throwing some stuff around at the moment. He's the commander-in-chief of the biggest, most powerful military in the world. And yet the health issues and everything he seems to be struggling with at the moment leave me gravely concerned. That is probably the most important thing that we want our leaders to do: be consistent, robust, and have credibility in the defence sphere. Yeah.
Well, I definitely don't want to put my toe on that side of the Atlantic in what is a very ferocious situation at the moment. But it must worry a lot of people. I've heard a lot of sort of back talk that Anthony Blinken is actually running the show at the moment. I'm sure I'm going to get hit over the head by a lot of people telling me that's rubbish, or that actually somebody else is doing it. But hopefully, whatever's coming out of America is a collective decision-making process. Very hard to think that's the case during an election year when everything is so polarised.
But whatever happens in any of the elections, you only have to look at President Putin's been around for a few decades now. Chinese leadership around for a long time. They must be laughing their socks off looking at how our uncertainty, how some of the candidates, their credibility, their ability to be a credible threat, be robust. It doesn't feel like we've got the JFK of this, of the world, who inspired a nation. Where is that? And I'm not blaming America at all. It seems to be institutionally a challenge we're facing at the moment, that neither of the two main candidates at the moment in the political elections seem to do well when it comes to leadership or character. And yet the very nature of what warfare is about, it's about deterrence, not big D, nuclear deterrence, but small d, that people know that you're robust, you're strong, that you have the military capability and you're prepared to use it if somebody crosses the line. That's about resolve, that's around commitment. Those qualities don't seem to be an overwhelming supply at the moment.
I agree. That is worrying. And let's see, from a Russia-Ukraine point of view for a second, let's see how the so-called spring offensive, which is slightly late but maybe happening at the moment from Russia's point of view, how that manages its way through summer. We'll then hit winter with all the problems. By then, of course, we'll have had the UK election. A lot of the European ones, the second time round, have happened as well. We've got the November thing over in America. So maybe things will be a lot clearer and will give people an opportunity to collaborate. I mean, the Labour Party in the UK are already making overtures to Trump in America to try and get back on his side, just in case. You talk about Kennedy, now the nephew, is making great strides. I don't know from a voting point of view, but if you're a Democrat, you'd call Kennedy Jr. a Republican. If you're a Republican, you call him a Democrat. So he has managed to sit in the middle of all of this, and he gets into the war issue and the associated economic and political dimensions of it as well. So, that's interesting.
But I think that given one of the pillars of our national security is NATO, and it's been pretty well advertised that a change of administration in the US might have profound implications for NATO. It does matter to us this side of the pond, what happens the other side of the pond. And I think it'll be really interesting. We're going to have to keep a close tabs on that one.
But we're not going to get as close as to say who we want to win.
No.
Are we? No, okay.
No.
John, there's been a international peace summit. It's finished. 90 odd nations attended. I'm always slightly skeptical when we have these big international meets or conferences that people are forced to create outcomes that don't have any lasting value. It would be good if that wasn't the case. I mean, what's your take on what was achieved and what's the direction of travel, with those who attended and actually those who didn't attend as well?
It's been an interesting conference because over 90 countries were represented. But interestingly, Russia wasn't there, wasn't invited. Might have been arrested if he had. China chose not to go, but also they were putting pressure on several other countries not to go or not to sign up. And as you say, they're trying to come up with some sort of agreement about, Russia's been bad, Ukraine is good, and here's the plan for peace. And not everybody signed up to that for a variety of reasons. It will be easy to criticise and say it was therefore of no value at all. I think we're both old enough that in a world of binary black and white, yes, it's limited value. But there's no doubt that there are some very positive things that come from it. One of which was the central focus was Zelensky's 10-point plan. Now, some of those points are Russia leave Ukraine completely. Clearly, nobody's going to make progress on that. But there were some others about security, about food security, energy security, stuff like that. And it creates a degree of alignment. And also, quite bluntly, the bottom line is Zelensky's been really good at keeping Ukraine at the top of the news agenda. With everything else going on, the one thing this conference did, it rose back up again. And a load of countries in the margins of it pledged to a 10-year security arrangement, because every time they meet Zelensky, they want to sign up to something else. The one thing that I'm uncomfortable with, though, is this was all about what will be the plan for negotiating peace. And I'm particularly reminded of how Russia approaches negotiations. We've got a short clip here to show how they approach negotiations.
Russia is making the demands, Russia is threatening, and now if we think that, oh, let's offer them something, then they actually get something that they didn't have before. And I've quoted this foreign minister, Alexei Gromyko, Soviet time foreign minister, several times, who said about the negotiation tactics of Soviet Union. Three things. First, demand the maximum. Do not ask, but demand something that has never been yours. Second, present ultimatums, threaten. And third, do not give 1 inch in negotiations, because there will be always people in the West who will offer you something. And then in the end, you will have 1/3 or even 1/2 of something you didn't have before.
So bluntly, I think it doesn't matter what the West says, it doesn't matter what the 90 countries agree today, until both sides are at the position where they're ready to talk for peace, and then there'll be a set of negotiations. It's very difficult to see that this will actually have changed the dial at all. But Zelensky's had some more pledges, and it's back up the news agenda. That's a positive outcome for Zelensky.
Okay. So, Sean, is Putin's sort of general way of handling these things that he comes along and steals your suit, works hard to say he's going to keep it, and then after negotiation gives you your trousers back, and you feel happy, but he's still got half your suit?
And that's the worry here. And I think if translate that to today, in fact, translate to November, part of the concern is that if there is a change of administration in the US, President Trump might be prepared to negotiate. In other words, compromise with Russia. And Russia keeps the trousers, keeps the jacket. Yeah. The danger is that's not his call. It's actually President Zelensky's call. But of course, America's providing a lot of support. And that is the worry, is actually you might bring the war to an end, but does that actually embolden Russia and, crucially, rewards military force to move borders? That is not something that anybody I've heard in the international community wants to sanction and approve.
So, on the other hand, going back to David Cameron's comments about we're allowing Ukraine to fight our war and it's really cheap because we've not lost any people, but Ukraine has. Maybe when the West feel they've squeezed as much out of Russia as they can and depleted, in terms of the optimal effect, depleted the Russian forces, they go, game over.
I think there's lots of ways that this war could end. Bluntly, the West is tiring of the war. We don't have the weapons. We've got our own financial issues. For most of us, the war is quite some distance away. And there are examples of history, Finland, Winter War, cede territory, and then it gets drawn to an end. But there are some interesting principles here. And I said overwhelmingly through my military and political colleagues now, they're talking about playing the long game with Putin. Militarily, it's going to be quite difficult to push him out. But economically, politically, bring those all together, they could be a powerful force over several years to make Russia and particularly Putin pay for his adventures in Ukraine.